When a worn wicker chair becomes the center of a death no one dares call murder, Miss Marple finds herself drawn into a garden where silence grew thicker than ivy. Welcome, dear listener. Come in from the chill and settle close. Tell us, where are you joining us from today? What time is it for you now? And how has your day been so far? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing from you, and it helps others discover these mysteries too. Now find something warm to sip, get comfortable, and let's begin. It was one of those late autumn afternoons when the garden, though no longer vibrant, held a kind of muted dignity, as though preparing for a long sleep. The ivy on the vicarage walls had begun to brown at the tips, its deep green dulled by the season's farewell, yet it curled still along the stone, as if reluctant to let go. Miss Marple, wrapped in a dove-grey cardigan, and wearing a felt hat that had once been navy, but was now politely faded, moved among the beds with quiet interest. There was a serenity in Little Windermere that suited her better than the noisy chaos of youth. Here it was the unspoken gestures, the barely lifted eyebrows at the post office, the exact way a tray was set at tea, those told the truth. She paused beside a weathered trellis of climbing roses, nodding slightly at some private thought, and turned as the voices of guests filtered from the lawn beyond. Afternoon tea at the vicarage was never a formal affair, but it did have its unspoken rituals. The table beneath the arbor had been laid with care, mismatched china, a sponge cake glazed to modest perfection, and sandwiches thin enough to pass village scrutiny. Colonel Ambrose Hartley sat a little apart from the rest, as was his custom, half shaded by the trailing branches of the arbor vines. His long legs were stretched before him, his hat tilted slightly forward over his brow, giving the impression of peaceful drowsiness. A cup rested precariously on the small table beside him. No one thought it odd. The colonel was known to enjoy these gatherings in quiet, not for conversation, but for presence. Poor man's had a long life, Mrs. Calthorpe remarked softly, her smile fond. Let him sleep. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on him a moment longer. The sun, now slanting low, threw long shadows across the lawn. Mrs. Calthorpe rose from her place beside the cake stand, brushing crumbs from her lap, and made her way toward the arbor. She carried a fresh cup of tea in one hand, and a linen napkin in the other. Ambrose, she called gently, the way one calls a husband out of an old habit of familiarity. I've brought you a warmer cup. She reached out, and stopped. Her hand touched the colonel's wrist, then recoiled as if burnt. The cup fell, smashing on the paving stones. Oh, she gasped, stepping back, her voice trembling. He's not someone call. But no one moved just yet. The kind of silence that follows realization hung heavy. Only Miss Marple set down her plate without sound. The vicar, who had been discoursing amiably about chrysanthemums to a cluster of elderly ladies, turned at the sound of breaking china, and rushed forward, calling his wife's name. The guests stirred, some rising half-heartedly, unsure whether to show concern, or remain politely seated. A few gathered their shawls with a kind of helpless decorum, as though illness were contagious through fabric. Miss Marple, however, did not rise. She remained seated, her fingers folded lightly over her handbag, her gaze fixed on the figure slumped in the wicker chair. The colonel's posture was unchanged, but something, some small tilt of the head, some unnatural stillness, did not belong to sleep. The world had shifted, and only those who paid attention would notice where the shift had begun. Miss Marple stood at last, though not in haste. Her eyes swept the scene, not with the shock others might have shown, but with the gentle attentiveness of a woman who had once mended a dozen church kneelers and remembered every thread she'd sewn. She moved toward the arbor, her steps muffled by the late-season grass. At the colonel's feet, where the broken cup had landed, something curious caught her eye. A second cup, not Mrs. Calthorpe's fresh one, but another, older, cracked at the handle, lay on its side. Its contents had left a faint stain on the flagstone, a brownish shadow with no scent of tea. Except there was a smell, not the expected garden mixture of lavender and lemon balm, nor the fading roses. It was faint, but definite, bitter, almonds. Miss Marple did not wrinkle her nose. Instead, she reached out with one gloved hand and gently righted the cup, the edge of her mouth drawn in quiet thought. The wicker chair, when one looked closely, did not quite match the others in the set, not in color, nor in position. It faced slightly off-center from the rest of the tea arrangement, as though it had been hastily shifted back into place. A cushion sagged unevenly. Miss Marple stepped to the side, viewing the arrangement from another angle, as she might have assessed a lopsided floral display at the harvest fair. Something was wrong with the weave, not visibly, not to the untrained eye, but she had seen enough caning and garden repairs in her time to know when a thing had been touched without love. She said nothing, but a thought, a rather firm one, rooted itself and refused to be dislodged. The vicar's wife stood trembling now beside her husband, who was murmuring about fainting spells and calling for salts. Someone fetched a rug. Someone else suggested brandy, but Miss Marple, her voice as soft as ever, addressed Mrs. Calthorpe directly. "My dear," she said kindly, "I wonder if you would telephone Dr. Linton. I dare say the poor Colonel might have had an unfortunate turn, though," she paused delicately, her eyes returning to the chair, "one should never assume a peaceful end simply because the room is quiet." The words, though gently spoken, struck like the faintest tremor beneath a still surface. In the days following the Colonel's death, the village fell into that peculiar rhythm of respectful chatter and discreet speculation. As is the case in such communities, no single person could recall precisely when Colonel Hartley had returned to Little Windmere, only that one day he was simply there, occupying the old Hartley residence on the hill, and walking with a stick that never seemed strictly necessary. There had been no grand announcement, no welcome home, just a new name at the post office counter, a quiet presence at the Sunday service, and the gradual reappearance of Hartley silver at the harvest sale. No one spoke of where he had been, but everyone wondered, and some, particularly those who had long memories, wondered what had finally drawn him back to the place that had not mourned his absence. Miss Marple, who had an enviable ability to listen without drawing attention to herself, spent the afternoon gathering fragments of impression from neighbors who had known the Colonel, or thought they had. "He was always polite, yes," said Miss Grenstead, lowering her voice as she folded away a set of hymnals, "but not warm, not like his wife was. You always felt there was something unfinished about him." Others described him in similar terms: courteous to the baker, punctual with his tithe, and not unkind, but never friendly. He was a man who preferred solitude even when company sat beside him. A man, as Miss Marple mused silently, who wore gentility like a garment rather than a skin. It was Mrs. Bostwick, relict of the late Dr. Bostwick, and possessor of formidable insight behind her crochet hooks, who spoke most plainly. "Ambrose Hartley," she said, rocking slightly in her winged parlor chair, "never did recover from being disappointed. Not in a person, you understand, but in life." She sniffed, looped a thread, and added, "His wife was the last person to bring light into that house. And after she passed, I believe he made a study of loneliness, until it stopped being a choice." Miss Marple nodded once, thoughtfully. There were regrets that soured more with silence than speech. The coroner, a competent man of reliable discretion, issued his finding the following morning: heart failure, age and long-term strain, a natural end in all respects. The guests accepted it with grateful solemnity, save for Miss Marple, who neither protested nor agreed. She merely sipped her tea and let the words settle like dust. It was a sound verdict, sensible, yet she could not quite forget the misaligned chair, nor the faint bitter trace in the air, nor the way Mrs. Calthorpe's hand had recoiled, as if touching something not merely cold, but wrong. The simplest explanations often held truth, but truth, Miss Marple knew, could wear the face of a lie when it suited comfort. Later, as twilight bled into the hedgerows, Miss Marple sat with the vicar's wife beneath the pergola. The wind had turned cool, and the rosehips clung darkly to the bare stems. "I dare say it's a kindness, really," Mrs. Calthorpe murmured, "to pass peacefully, without pain or fear." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied. "Though I do wonder," she paused, her eyes following a squirrel's brisk journey along the garden wall, "if you noticed a smell, just the faintest scent. Almonds, perhaps?" Mrs. Calthorpe looked up, puzzled. "Almonds? Well, we had Battenberg yesterday, but no, not from cake." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I merely ask because, you know, prussic acid, which occurs naturally in certain seeds, gives off a similar scent. Of course it could have been nothing, quite possibly nothing at all." Her tone was light, almost cheerful, but the breeze seemed colder as it swept across the lawn. The solicitor, Mr. Havelock, was not a man given to dramatic pronouncements. When Miss Marple stopped by quite incidentally with some papers for the church bazaar, he mentioned it only in passing. "Yes," he said, adjusting his spectacles, "the Colonel did come in last week. 10 days ago, in fact. Made some rather significant changes to his will." His pen tapped against the blotter as he frowned. "Removed his nephew Julian, a rather, well, let's say spirited young man, and left the majority of his estate to a charitable trust. Quite a shift, really." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes resting briefly on the date scrawled at the margin, the 10th of October. The ink was still vivid, the kind that took time to fade. Too vivid, Miss Marple thought, for a man supposedly at the end of his strength. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her bedroom window, knitting half-heartedly as dusk folded itself into the village lanes. From her vantage point, she could see the corner of the vicarage garden, where the empty wicker chair remained untouched. A man does not revise his will on impulse, she reflected, particularly not a man like Colonel Hartley, who weighed his decisions with the same rigidity he applied to punctuality. To remove one's heir was not merely financial, it was familial, symbolic. The final judgment of a life once entrusted, and yet to leave everything to a trust. To deny blood in favor of charity. Her needles paused. No, there was something beneath this, a bitterness, not in taste but in action. And that sort of bitterness, quiet, simmering, unacknowledged, could turn even a wicker chair into an instrument of retribution. She resumed knitting. But the pattern she followed now was no longer made of wool. The solicitor's office was a room of worn leather chairs, long settled dust, and heavy drapes that never quite opened fully. Mr. Havelock, the village's legal custodian of all things discreet, kept to understatement the way a bishop keeps to scripture. "It was Julian, you know," he said softly. After offering Miss Marple a boiled sweet she politely declined. Ambrose had left everything to him, everything, until it wasn't so. Miss Marple, knitting bag folded primly on her lap, looked down at the corner of the hearthrug where a small dog had once chewed the fringe. When was the change made? 16 days before the Colonel's death, signed in blue-black ink, neat hand, clear mind, no doubt about its legality. He paused. The change was quiet, just as he was, removed the boy entirely. She nodded once. The real mysteries, she thought, often began not with the appearance of a name, but its erasure, It was technically a worthy cause. The St. Anne's Home for Widows of Fallen Servicemen had a long-standing reputation, a modest endowment, and an annual fete where jam was sold and brass bands played with melancholy enthusiasm. And yet, as Miss Marple sipped weak tea in the church hall the next day, the murmurs were already beginning. "A home," said Mrs. Viney with a furrowed brow, "for people he didn't know. Such a thing does not strike one as affectionate." "Affectionate," murmured Miss Grinstead. "Detached, more like." Miss Marple sat quietly. The Colonel had disinherited a flesh-and-blood relation in favor of a faceless institution. Generosity was not the point, it was removal, the washing away of lineage. No, this was not the cool decision of a distant man. It was the deliberate act of one who had decided that legacy, real legacy, could be rewritten. The name Julian Hartley surfaced like a fish breaking water, a quick flick, a ripple, then gone again. Few spoke of him, and when they did, it was always with a careful pause between sentences. He had debts, someone whispered behind the hat stand at the grocer's, and not just to banks. Gambling, said another, less timidly. A shame, considering how his mother tried to raise him straight. Miss Marple asked little, but listened often. The rumors formed a sketch, a young man with ambition, but no ballast, charm too easily traded, and a taste for fast departures. He had gone to South Africa, or perhaps Spain, or perhaps nowhere, after all. The only thing agreed upon was this: he had not returned for the funeral, and that in a village like Little Windmere was a silence more condemning than any spoken word. In the far corner of the vicarage shed, where summer tools hibernated and deck chairs leaned like sleepy guards, stood the wicker chair. It had been moved there after the death, out of courtesy to the widow's nerves. Miss Marple came alone. The air smelled faintly of paraffin and damp grass. She approached the chair not as one seeking horror, but understanding. The weave was neat but old, a little brittle at the edges. She knelt slowly, knees protesting the effort, and examined the underside. One reed had lifted slightly, not torn, but unfastened, as though disturbed and refitted. She ran her fingers along the curve of the seat back. There, too, was something amiss. A splintered edge where the strand should have lain smooth. To most eyes, it would be nothing. But Miss Marple had mended wicker before, in the church hall, a basket for flower tokens, and she knew the difference between wear and quiet tampering. Somewhere beneath that weave, she thought, a secret had pressed against the surface. As she straightened slowly, brushing reed dust from her glove, a curious recollection drifted forward, not from crime novels or courtroom tales, but from a missionary's letter read long ago at a women's guild meeting. It spoke of a book sent to a colonial governor, beautifully bound in red leather, harmless in appearance until it released a poison from its gilded spine, not to kill instantly, but to linger, to punish through time. She remembered the hush in the hall that day, the way the vicar had cleared his throat, as if disapproving of the story's sensational tone. But Miss Marple had not forgotten. Now, staring at the innocent strands of the wicker chair, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with weather. Poison need not be swallowed, nor injected. It could be housed, nestled in ordinary things, in books, in lace, or even perhaps in the hollowed arc of a wicker seat. The notion gathered form like mist over the cricket green, slowly at first, then all at once. Not a dramatic mechanism, not a needle jutting viciously like in detective thrillers. No, something subtler, more wicked for its silence. A hollow reed perhaps, just wide enough to house a thorn, or a spring, fashioned from a watch part, coiled to respond only when weight bore down. A killer would need no more than clever hands, and the patience of foresight. She thought of the chair's alignment, oddly set back from the others, as if meant to compel a full lean, and the Colonel upright in bearing, always proper yet known to relax that final inch when tea was served. It would not take much. A pinpoint, a dose precise enough to seize the heart without struggle, and no one would know. Except, Miss Marple breathed in slowly, perhaps the person who had noticed the scent, and the cup, and the chair that had been just slightly out of place. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her small writing table, pen in hand, her notebook open to a clean page. Outside, Little Windermere surrendered to dusk with a sigh of smoke and leaf mold. Lamps flickered behind lace curtains. The last bicycle clattered past the gate. She wrote down 3 names, then crossed one out. The fire murmured low behind her. A kettle ticked on the hob, but her thoughts circled not around the act, nor even the instrument, but the reason, not money. Never just money. She thought of Julian Hartley, whose name had vanished from a will, of the Colonel, proud and private, who had chosen a distant charity over his own flesh and blood, of something deeper than inheritance, a need to punish, and that punishment, Miss Marple thought, had been answered. A crime of elegance, of silence, of knowing just how a man sits in a chair when he thinks no one is watching. She closed her notebook. Outside, the church bell tolled 8, the sound soft as regret, heavy as justice deferred. Tomorrow she would begin asking questions, but tonight she let the weight of knowing settle gently, like ash. Julian Hartley arrived on the morning of the funeral, in a dark coat that fit too well, and shoes polished a little too brightly for mourning. He stepped out of the hired car with a quiet authority that seemed less rooted in grief and more in expectation, the sort of expectation that studies the expression of others, watches for hesitation, listens for whispers. Miss Marple, seated beside the vicar's wife near the churchyard gate, observed him without direct gaze. He was tall, leaner than his uncle had been, with sharp features that might once have been charming, but were now hollowed slightly at the cheekbones, a face made for smiling, but carefully trained to withhold it. His handshake with the vicar was restrained, his glance at the coffin, cursory, but his eyes, Miss Marple noted, never lingered on the grave. They scanned the mourners instead, as if something had been left behind, or worse, taken. The wake was held by modest tradition at the vicarage. There was tea in silver pots, ham sandwiches without crusts, and a fruit cake that had seen every funeral in Little Windermere for the past decade. Julian Hartley stood near the hearth, sipping from a cup he did not refill, his gaze travelling absently about the room. Uncle kept a small cabinet, did he not? He asked too casually, to no one in particular. In the study, glass-fronted, contained a set of Chinese snuff-boxes, Qing dynasty. He was rather proud of them. Mrs. Calthorpe, startled, blinked. "I believe they're still there." Julian nodded, though his eyes narrowed faintly. "One I think had a dragon motif in cloisonné, worth a small fortune these days. Funny the things people overlook." Miss Marple, across the room, stirred her tea with great care. It was not grief that furrowed Julian's brow. It was absence of something he had expected to claim. It was 2 days later when Miss Marple paid her visit to Hartley House, a gesture she made under the guise of retrieving a donation of linens the Colonel had promised for the church mission. Julian, having installed himself in the manor without formally inheriting it, received her with stiff politeness and offered no refreshment. The house, once stately, now bore the air of a place long asleep. Curtains remained half-drawn, rugs had dust fringing their edges. The air smelt faintly of smoke and camphor. Miss Marple noted the drawn shutters in the drawing-room, the oil lamp unlit in the hallway, and the cold hearth that no one had troubled to stir. It was a house not in mourning, but in retreat, as though the death had not entered it, but had always lived there, silent and undisturbed, waiting. The drawing-room had been closed, Julian said, since the Colonel's passing. He opened it with a flourish that rang a little hollow, like an actor taking the stage too early. The scent of beeswax and old velvet lingered, and the fire screen had been moved, slightly askew. Miss Marple's eyes passed over the furnishings, resting at last upon the family portrait above the mantel, a stern depiction of the Colonel's father and mother, painted with such stiffness they might never have spoken in life. And yet it was not their expressions that caught her attention. It was the bottom corner of the canvas, frayed, curling forward, as if someone had once grasped it with hurried fingers and stopped just short of tearing it free. It had not happened recently, but it had not, she felt, been forgiven either. Miss Marple, having made polite remarks about the embroidery on a nearby cushion and the faded elegance of the rugs, asked whether the Colonel had kept his books in the same room as always. Julian, distracted, gestured vaguely toward the library in return to polishing a decanter that did not need polishing. The library door opened without protest. The room beyond was dim and very still. Rows of neatly shelved volumes lined the walls, their spines mute and expectant. She moved quietly, her gloved hand trailing the edge of the desk where a blotter rested, unused. Then she paused. A small cabinet, low to the floor, near the hearth, bore a thin veil of dust across its top, except in one place, a faint smudge, crescent-shaped, as though someone had recently gripped the edge to pull it open. Not much, not obvious, but just enough. A careful thief, or a nervous heir. Kneeling slowly, knees creaking in protest, Miss Marple inspected the cabinet more closely. The keyhole was unremarkable at first glance, but years of threading needles and mending hymn books had taught her where to look. There, just to the side of the key plate, was a scratch. Not long, not deep, but diagonal, the kind that comes from a key turned in expertly or with haste. She tested the lock gently. It held, though not cleanly. The catch gave a small hiccup before settling back into place. A drawer opened by someone not accustomed to its working, someone who did not own the key, or had found it only recently, and someone who, she suspected, had not done so for the first time. As she prepared to take her leave, Miss Marple thanked Julian with cool civility and stepped into the dim corridor that led toward the front door. A hush lay over the house, broken only by the faint ticking of a long case clock on the landing. It was then she heard voices, soft, tense, from beyond the stairwell. Pausing beneath the arch, she caught a glimpse of Julian speaking to a housemaid in the shadows of the lower hall. His posture was sharp, urgent. The girl, no older than 20, with pale hair tucked under a neat cap, was staring downward, wringing her hands. She whispered something, and almost involuntarily, her gaze flicked toward a closed door, the study. Julian turned suddenly, and Miss Marple stepped lightly into motion, her expression composed. She thanked the butler and departed. But the image stayed with her, whispers, glances, a door too carefully shut, and a girl who knew what silence cost. There is something particularly fragile about a figure observed from a distance, when posture says more than words ever might. Miss Marple, returning from the post office that morning, paused on the path near the village green, her attention drawn to the girl seated beneath the old sycamore, whose leaves had begun to curl and scatter. The young woman wore a dark velvet cloak, slightly too heavy for the weather, its hem brushing against her worn shoes. She sat on the stone bench in rigid stillness, though her shoulders trembled faintly, not the theatrical shudder of public grief, but something quieter, more private, the kind of sorrow that one does not wish to explain. Miss Marple observed her for some time before approaching, not out of curiosity, but because she recognized a tremor when it resembled something held in rather than let out, and those she had learned were always the most revealing. The girl lifted her head at the sound of Miss Marple's step upon the gravel. Her face was pale, with the kind of translucent complexion that rarely enjoys the outdoors, and her eyes, grayish-blue ringed faintly with fatigue, met Miss Marple's with polite hesitation. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, brushing at her face with a gloved hand. "I didn't mean to trespass." Miss Marple offered a soft murmur of reassurance, and sat beside her with gentle deliberation. The girl gave her name Lydia Marsh. "My mother was once in service at Hartley House, many years ago." Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression unreadable. The name meant nothing to her, and yet, as she looked at Lydia's profile, something in the nose, the chin, she felt the oddest echo, a familiarity of type, not memory. Blood, she thought, always finds a way to declare itself. "I came to see him," Lydia said softly, her eyes on the worn toe of her boot. "I travelled all this way, and I stood at that gate, like a child asking permission. But the door never opened." Miss Marple said nothing, but her silence invited more than speech might have. "I left a note," Lydia continued, "with my name, my mother's name. He would have remembered her. She was with him before the war." She took a breath and looked away. "A maid, you see, in France. Before the regiment moved." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her face remained composed. "I was told to wait. Then someone, a man I didn't know, came and said the colonel was not receiving visitors. No message, no reply." Her voice trembled, but it was pride, not grief, that held the tears back. "I didn't want anything," she whispered. "I just wanted to look at him." The cloak, Miss Marple now saw, had once been fine, lined in satin, its fastenings carefully stitched, but it bore the marks of years, and the faint smell of lavender soap clung to it, as though preserved in a drawer for better days. "My mother is very ill," Lydia said quietly. "She can no longer walk. I came in her place." Her voice tightened. "We didn't want money, just help, a recommendation for the sanatorium in Surrey. I thought perhaps he might remember, that he might feel something, some duty." Miss Marple reached gently into her handbag for a handkerchief, offering it without a word. "He would have seen me if he'd known I was hers," Lydia said, "but the door never opened." It was, Miss Marple thought, the sort of grief reserved not for love lost, but dignity denied. Later that afternoon, as Miss Marple crossed the green again, she paused behind the holly hedge that lined the edge of the vicarage path, not out of eavesdropping, but rather a kind of instinct, the way one watches a weather vane shift without knowing precisely what storm it foretells. Lydia stood in quiet conversation with Edward Calthorpe, the vicar's son. He was a mild-mannered young man, scholarly, polite, with a tendency to blush under direct praise, and yet here he stood, speaking earnestly, his hands moving in small apologetic gestures. Miss Marple caught the tone, not flirtation, not even comfort. It was the sound of explanation, of something owed. Edward's shoulders were stiff, his brow drawn. Lydia nodded once, but her lips did not soften. Whatever kindness he offered, it had come too late to make up for something left unsaid. As Lydia turned to go, Miss Marple noticed something peculiar, not in expression, but in attire. The young woman's gloves were old, not in themselves unusual, but worn through at the lining, a small fray near the wrist where cotton poked through the velvet, and from the side of her handbag, a folded envelope jutted, cream-colored, flattened, its edges softened by handling. Miss Marple made no comment. She had long since learned that a threadbare glove said more than most declarations, and that an unsent letter carried a weight few could bear to speak aloud. She watched as Lydia walked away, back straight despite everything. It was not despair that marked her, but restraint, the kind that belongs to someone who has learned never to ask more than the world is willing to give. That evening, Miss Marple sat knitting by the parlour fire, when Edward entered with a distracted air, his hair wind-blown and his collar askew, signs that he had taken the long walk back from the station alone. He greeted her with customary courtesy, but there was a heaviness about him, an avoidance of the eyes. She asked, in the gentlest tone, did she catch her train all right? Yes, he replied quickly. Yes, I believe so. There was a pause, long and comfortable enough for truth to slip in, if it dared. Miss Marple said nothing more. She sensed the boy was carrying something he did not quite understand, and that perhaps, understanding it fully, would require more courage than he possessed. Some questions, after all, are not answered because they are not asked, and Miss Marple had always known the difference. It was not until the following morning, when Miss Marple sat knitting on the vicarage veranda, that a small inconsistency fluttered gently into her thoughts, like a leaf caught in an unexpected draught. The vicar's wife was recounting the day of the garden tea, not for the first time, describing in painstaking detail the moment she entered the kitchen to boil water and warm the cups. I remember thinking we'd run out of the pale pink ones, she said, and wondering if the green ones would do. Then I noticed the cups were already laid out under the arbor. Edward must have done it. Miss Marple nodded politely, but Edward had been in the vestry at the time, and there it was. The kettle had not yet been set to boil, and yet the cups were waiting, aligned and expectant. A hand had placed them early, too early, and not with tea in mind. Later that afternoon, while helping to rearrange a stack of hymnals in the parlour, Miss Marple's eye caught on something that did not belong. A thick, green-bound novel, The Tattered Regiment, popular in its time and of little literary merit, sat among a shelf of devotional commentaries and illustrated psalters. It was askew, tucked behind an embroidered church cushion, and bore a pressed geranium leaf as its makeshift marker. It was, unmistakably, the Colonel's reading material. Mrs. Culthorpe had mentioned it by name, stating he'd been half through it on the afternoon he died, and yet the parlour was 2 rooms away from the arbor, and the book, clearly, had not left this corner in days. So what had he been pretending to read beneath the vines? What had he been meant to be seen reading, and by whom? Miss Marple, with her usual gentle persistence, coaxed Mrs. Culthorpe into a second account of the tea preparations. It was not difficult. The woman found reassurance in repetition, as many do when brushing up against death. I set the cups, of course, she said, and placed the sugar bowl to the left, as always. Ambrose did like his tea sweet. 2 spoonfuls, always. Indeed, said Miss Marple softly. Though I wonder, did any of the cups show signs of sugar stirred in? Mrs. Culthorpe paused. Now that you mention it, I don't believe so. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. A man of fixed habit had sipped unsweetened tea, or had not sipped at all. Sometimes, she reflected, it is not what is added that tells the story, but what has been left out. The garden, when she returned to it, bore the hush of a place long since abandoned by ceremony. The arbor stood empty. The breeze rattled the edges of the trellis vine, now crisp with dryness. Miss Marple moved slowly across the grass, careful not to disturb the fallen petals. She paused before the wicker chair, now restored to its place under the vines. Its cushion had been removed, and the seat sagged ever so slightly. She studied the shape of it, the curve of the back, the the crossing of the lower supports, the faint twist in the armrest's plating. Chairs, she thought, like people, bear memory in the shape of their strain. And this one, this had held more than weight. It had borne intention. It was beneath the seat, where the underside was less tightly woven, that her fingers found what her eyes could not. She did not flinch, only withdrew her hand and took out her spectacles. With the smallest silver crochet hook from her reticule, she loosened the edge of a reed panel. Tucked deep within the hollow space was a tiny object, no longer than a sewing pin. It was wrapped in a scrap of linen, stained faintly brown, and secured by a thread that appeared to have frayed naturally, but not so naturally that it did not suggest interference. Unwrapping it carefully, Miss Marple revealed a thorn, sharp, hardened, and unnaturally dark at its tip. She held it between her gloved fingers and stared for a long moment. A chair, a simple chair, but designed to prick, silently, invisibly, and leave behind something far deadlier than splinters. She looked again at the linen, a scrap torn from something once used daily, once familiar. Betrayal, she thought, is never far from comfort. Miss Marple took the scrap to Dr. Linton, whose knowledge of rural poisons was matched only by his distaste for drama. He sniffed the cloth, examined the thorn, and scowled. "Not cyanide," he said. "Nor belladonna. No bruising, no blistering." He tapped the table with his forefinger. "But see that stain there, faint yellowish brown, that's foxglove, digitalis. Used improperly, it attacks the heart. No odor, no taste, and in concentrated tincture, quite lethal through the bloodstream." Miss Marple nodded. "Injected, if it pierced the skin, even briefly." He glanced up. He'd never have felt it, might have thought it a scratch from the furniture. She took the thorn back, carefully repackaged, and slipped it into her reticule. Foxglove, not the dramatic toxin of penny thrillers, but a cultivated danger, a gardener's poison, an educated choice. One does not pick foxglove by accident, nor wield it without knowledge of where and how it kills. That evening, Miss Marple sat with her knitting untouched, the wool draped in soft spirals across her lap. The evidence was there: a tampered chair, a thorn, a rare but effective poison, selected not in panic, but with the steady hand of foresight. This had not been a crime of passion. There had been no quarrel in the arbor, no raised voices or impulsive strikes. No, this had been patient, planned, executed with such quietness that the victim had not even known he was dying until it was done. It required someone who understood the Colonel's habits, how he leaned, how long he stayed, what side he favored when seated. It was not murder with a flourish, it was murder by familiarity, and beneath it all, Miss Marple sensed it, not greed, not revenge, something older, something colder. Betrayal, she thought again, and perhaps shame. But shame does not kill on its own. Someone had to place the thorn, and someone had. It was one of those November afternoons when the sun seemed an afterthought, low, pale, and filtered through a grey veil of damp. Miss Marple and Edward Calthorpe walked side by side along the vicarage path, their footsteps softened by the thick layer of fallen leaves. Yellow sycamore, burnt orange chestnut, the occasional ragged elm, all nature's quiet farewells, scattered without ceremony. They had not spoken for several minutes. Edward's hands were deep in his coat pockets, his eyes on the gravel. "I've been meaning," he began, then faltered. Miss Marple merely inclined her head as though the wind itself had whispered something worth hearing. "I think you already know, don't you?" She did not answer, not with words. Only a slow turn of her eyes toward him. And it was that silence, heavy, humane, that unlocked the next admission. "I knew Lydia from before," Edward said at last. his voice roughened with restraint. My mother used to speak of a girl, a quiet one, always listening, who came with her mother to help at Hartley House during the war. Miss Marple's brows lifted gently. She did not interrupt. She'd been born in Devon, but brought here when she was still in nappies. Her mother worked in the Colonel's household, discreetly, but long enough. He hesitated. There were whispers, not in public, of course. But you know how villages are. And then Lydia told me what her mother had said when she was old enough to wonder why no one bore her name. Miss Marple's knitting fingers tightened slightly on the handle of her cane. He was her father, Edward said. The Colonel. She came not seeking favor but acknowledgement. The leaves rustled above them like the stirring of a curtain, one that had, for too long, hidden something sorrowful. It was my idea, Edward admitted, eyes fixed on a hedgerow turning bare. I told her to write, to be brave, that things had changed. Miss Marple nodded slowly. One hopes they have, but people, especially men of a certain age, tend to cherish their illusions more dearly than their obligations. She wrote to him, she asked for a meeting, nothing more, just to speak. A robin darted across their path and vanished into the thorn bush. He never replied, not directly, but a fortnight later she received a message from the solicitor, cold, dismissive. He exhaled shakily. And I told her it was worth trying, that there might be decency in him yet. Miss Marple's gaze remained on the path, where a single red leaf trembled without wind. Courage, she murmured, deserves better than silence. Edward's voice grew steadier, though each word seemed to cost him something. Lydia was humiliated. The solicitor, Godfrey Owen, arrived with a sealed envelope. He didn't look at her once. She opened it there. He nodded. A banker's draft. No letter, no explanation, just a slip of paper with instructions to use the funds as she saw fit, and never attempt contact again. Miss Marple's face, usually so placid, tightened imperceptibly at the corners. She left the room without a word. Edward continued. But later, in the churchyard, I found her tearing the envelope into pieces. She kept the check, though. Her mother needed medicine. They paused at the old iron gate. It squeaked faintly as Edward touched it, perhaps from rust, perhaps from sentiment. There are ways to kill a connection without blood, he said. Yes, said Miss Marple softly, and they seldom leave fingerprints. They walked a little farther in silence. A crow called once overhead before vanishing behind the church steeple. I suppose, Edward said at last. The Colonel thought himself noble, sparing her the scandal, sparing himself the bother. Miss Marple's reply came after a pause. Men of his generation were trained to uphold appearance above all, honor, in the narrow sense. But honor without compassion becomes cruelty in good tailoring. She adjusted her scarf as a breeze caught the edge of her hat. Illegitimacy is a label invented by the lawful to protect their comfort. It tells us more about the legitimizers than those they exclude. Edward said nothing, but his jaw twitched. And sometimes, she added gently, what seems like a minor exclusion to one becomes a lifelong wound to another. He turned away then, not from shame, but perhaps from the weight of truths not spoken in his family's house. They had returned to the churchyard gate, where lichen crept up the stones like time reclaiming secrets. Edward paused beside the bench, where Lydia had once sat. I keep wondering, he said, if the shock of her coming, the reality of her, did something to him. Miss Marple studied him closely. You believe the stress of her presence contributed to his death? I don't mean in a fairy tale sense, not divine justice. But he was already weak, the doctor said so. Perhaps her letter, her face, perhaps they disturbed something settled in him. And if the poison hadn't, he stopped. Then the heart might have, eventually, she said. He looked at her, startled. You're certain then? Miss Marple gave a quiet, reflective smile. I am only certain that the body falters more quickly when the soul is under siege. She placed one gloved hand gently on the stone beside her, and some silences weigh more than words. They stood for a while, watching the shadows lengthen as the bells began to chime from St. Mildred's cess. The air had grown colder, and Edward pulled his coat tighter, though not from wind alone. I feel responsible, he said. Miss Marple regarded him with unhurried kindness. Because you opened the door. He gave a short, pained laugh. Because I urged her toward it. She turned then, fully. Edward, do you know what guilt is most often made of? He shook his head. Pride turned inward, the wish to have been wiser than our hearts allowed. But there is no crime in encouraging truth. She suffered, yes, but not from you. The bells faded into silence. Edward looked up at the bare trees. I only wish I'd done more. Miss Marple touched his sleeve. You did enough to regret, and that is already more than most do to care. They parted at the church gate, the truth still unspoken in full, but ready now perhaps to breathe. Miss Marple sat once again at the vicarage tea-table, where the sunlight, thin as muslin, filtered through the lace-curtained windows and drew long shadows across the porcelain. Her eyes, which seemed to rest but never slumber, followed the delicate blue pattern on the saucers. There were 5 cups, weren't there? She asked mildly. And yet one was already set out before anyone else arrived. Mrs. Culthorpe, startled mid-pour, glanced at the tray. Yes, well, I suppose I must have set it there in advance. But you brought the pot directly from the kitchen, Miss Marple murmured, her voice almost indulgent. And I remember quite clearly, the rest were still stacked. Only one stood alone, waiting. The vicar's wife said nothing, but her hand trembled ever so slightly as she placed the sugar tongs down, and Miss Marple, smiling gently, saw more in that tremble than words would ever yield. That same afternoon, beneath the soft murmuring of autumn branches, Miss Marple made her way to the garden arbor, a place of unassuming charm and shadowed memory. There were 3 chairs beneath the overhang. One of them, the oldest, its paint flaked like a forgotten promise, stood awkwardly askew, as though it had not been placed, but abandoned. Miss Marple looked around. Odd, she said aloud, to no one in particular. I don't believe this one was here the last time I visited. Her gloved hand trailed along its armrest, not from idle curiosity, but from the instinct of one who had once seen a murder solved by a misplaced fern. The chair, like a ghost, unwilling to leave, whispered nothing, but the silence around it seemed to agree it had not always belonged. She walked farther down the gravel path, past hedges beginning to brown at their tips, until the summer-house came into view, its shutters drawn, its door ever so slightly ajar. Inside, dust lay thick, disturbed only by a trail of small scuffs, not deep enough for boots, but just enough for careful steps. Miss Marple paused, adjusting her spectacles. One of the chairs bore the unmistakable coat of disuse, except where it didn't. A patch on the right side of the seat and along the lower rung was cleaner, as though hands had rested there, lifted something, replaced it. Beneath the chair lay a few broken strands of wicker, frayed and darkened. She bent with effort, her fingers brushing the floor, gathering more than dust. Someone, she murmured, has been very busy in a place meant for no one, and the wicker, though still, seemed almost to recoil. She turned the chair gently, fingers moving across the backrest, feeling for what the eye might overlook. It was not long before she found it, a knot of woven reed, slightly thicker than its neighbors, and not quite right in shape. Miss Marple pulled at it gently. The knot shifted under pressure, and one edge, cleanly snipped, frayed in a way that betrayed inexperience. "It wasn't a craftsman," she said softly. "It was someone mimicking one." The knot had been retied hastily, as if to conceal what had once been hidden within. Something sharp, perhaps. Something meant to remain undetected until it was too late. And as she stood once more, her knees aching with age, but her mind clear as frost, she knew the killer had not acted in haste, but with unsettling intention, not murder of rage, but of quiet, deliberate rehearsal. Miss Marple returned to the garden, just as Julian Hartley emerged from the drawing-room, lighting a cigarette with a hand that trembled only after the flame had caught. "Oh, Miss Marple," he said, with a hint too much surprise. "Taking a stroll. I do like to check on old places," she replied, "and the summer house has always intrigued me." Julian smiled faintly. "I was there myself, earlier, looking for the cat. She's taken to hiding under the chairs." "So she has," said Miss Marple pleasantly. Later, speaking in the scullery, the vicar's maid frowned. "Mr. Hartley," she said, "that's odd. I saw the cat asleep in the pantry nearly the whole afternoon." And though the comment was casual, it fell in Miss Marple's mind like a stone in a still pond, sending ripples into every memory of that day. It was the milkman of all people who offered the next small thread. "I don't like to say, ma'am," he told Miss Marple quietly, "but I saw someone walk across the lawn toward the arbor, just past 3. Thought it odd, that early." "Did you recognize him?" He shook his head. "Tall, dark coat, walked quick and careful. I only caught a glimpse from the gate. No hat, no, just a silhouette, really. But I'm sure he went toward the arbor, not away from it." The milkman paused. "Now you say it." "No. Toward." Miss Marple nodded with mild gratitude, her expression unreadable. She thought then of the saucer already set, the cup waiting alone, the retied knot. Whoever had walked there first had not done so for fresh air. They had arrived early, not by chance, but by design. That evening, as twilight softened the edges of every hedge and post, Miss Marple sat by the hearth, a small basket of mending at her side, though her hands did not move. She was thinking of the reed, the false knot, the frayed end, the awkward retie. Not accidental, not idle tampering. It had been chosen with care, worked upon in solitude. Whoever had done it had understood how to make pain seem accidental, how to disguise murder in the guise of innocent wear. And more than that, they had trusted that a wicker chair so often associated with comfort and leisure would invite no suspicion. The weapon, a thorn or needle, had been housed within the chair, beneath its seat or arm, activated by pressure, a trap in the guise of hospitality, and the victim, the colonel, had chosen that very chair himself, which meant the killer had known his habits, had observed, timed and woven death into the very furniture of trust. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, and saw not the act, but the intention behind it. It was a Thursday when Miss Marple took the path behind the churchyard, and crossed the lane to reach the small ivy-covered cottage where Mrs. Wickham resided. The former lace-worker, now nearly blind in one eye, but twice as sharp in mind, welcomed her with a nod and a pot of chicory coffee. They sat among rows of neatly folded cretonnes and faded samplers, a room heavy with lavender and history. Miss Marple placed the cushion from the wicker chair upon the table between them, its once bright fabric dulled by years of use and recent deceit. "It's not the needlework I question, dear," she said mildly, "but something deeper, quite literally. Mrs. Wickham leaned forward, one hand brushing the cushion's surface, her brow creased with immediate suspicion. "Ah," she said softly, "that's not right, not right at all." And her fingers, arthritic, but knowing, began their quiet work. Mrs. Wickham pinched the center of the cushion between her thumbs and forefingers, pressing just so. "There," she murmured. "Feel that?" Miss Marple leaned closer, and at her friend's urging, placed her palm lightly atop the fabric. It did not resist as it should. The give was too smooth, too centralized, like air captured beneath skin. "For a cushion of this age," said Mrs. Wickham, "you'd expect it to be uneven, broken in. This one breathes as if something new lives beneath." Miss Marple's eyes, blue and clear, did not blink. "Not restuffed?" "Oh no," Mrs. Wickham replied firmly, "not restuffed. Tampered." She picked up her seam ripper, the kind with a curved blade shaped like a miniature hook, and poised it carefully above a faint line of stitching, barely visible near the hem. "If you'll allow me," she said, "I believe we have something to uncover." With the delicacy of a woman who had once sewn bridal veils for duchesses, Mrs. Wickham undid the seam, lifting the outer layer of fabric back like a lid. Beneath lay padding, cotton, worn and flattened, and then something else. "Here we are," she breathed. "This isn't right." Buried just beneath the stuffing, stitched between layers, was a small compartment, no larger than a coin purse, but deliberate, precise. It had not been part of any original craft. The thread binding its edges was a newer gray, tight and careful, like the work of someone who knew the eye might someday follow. Together they opened it, and within the tiny cavity they found a wrapped bundle, muslin folded around something metallic and sharp. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "That is no accident. That is a murder built into comfort, a crime padded in hospitality." And she sat back, knowing the next layer would reveal something colder still. Unwrapping the muslin, they found a device scarcely larger than a thimble, its brass dull with age, yet the mechanism within unnervingly intact. A central spring, wound tight and fixed to a tiny plunger, supported a sliver of steel protruding delicately from its crown. "There's oil on the base," said Mrs. Wickham, peering closely, "and something darker on the tip." Miss Marple lifted it gently with a silver teaspoon, careful not to make contact. "It smells of dried herbs," she murmured. "No common poison, but a tincture, old, soaked into the tip like ink into blotting paper." The device was beautifully cruel. A slight pressure, the weight of a seated man, would drive the needle upward through cloth and skin, with no sound but the creak of wicker, and no evidence but a faint, delayed tremble. "Precise, hidden, silent," said Miss Marple. Mrs. Wickham looked pale. A trap in every sense. Miss Marple folded the muslin back around it and said softly, "And it worked." There was no haste in the making of such a contraption, that much was certain. Whoever devised it had not merely intended to kill, but to kill in absence. The murderer need not be present. The action had long been set in motion, lying dormant in the soft shadows of the summer house, waiting for habit to do the rest. Miss Marple considered the psychology of it, the patience, the certainty that the victim would return to that chair, not another. It was a death plotted not in rage but in calculation, wrapped in routine and trust. "They didn't need to see it happen," she said aloud, as though the idea itself were a kind of sacrament. "They only needed to know it would." The device was a sentinel, a deadly clockwork awaiting the touch of memory, and Colonel Hartley, by sitting as he always did, had fulfilled its design. In the quiet that followed, Miss Marple sat with her hands folded, reflecting. The brilliance, if one dared use such a word, lay not in the construction of the mechanism, but in its reliance upon something deeper, human constancy. Colonel Hartley had always preferred the garden chair with the deeper seat, always the second cup of tea, never sugar, always the quiet corner near the arbor, his back to the roses. The killer knew this, not by guesswork, but by years of quiet watching. A murder of observation, she murmured. Of rhythm. Had he chosen a different chair, had the cushion shifted slightly, the device would have lain dormant, but he hadn't. He had followed his habits, and those habits had become a noose. Miss Marple looked down at the muslin-wrapped object and thought, murder is seldom as clever as its disguise. Miss Marple returned to the vicarage that evening, the device swaddled in muslin like a cursed relic. She made no dramatic pronouncement. That was not her way. Instead, she asked gently to sit by the fire, where the ticking of the clock held steady like a heartbeat. She glanced once at Edward, once at Julian, and then at Lydia, who sat quietly, hands in her lap. The girl's eyes were dry now, but not empty. There was knowledge there, not of mechanics or murder, but of pain long withheld. This, Miss Marple said, laying the muslin upon the table, was not an act of madness or impulse. No one spoke. It was waiting, she added softly. Not for a man, but for his pattern. The trap needed no hand, only time. Outside, the wind stirred the last of the withered leaves, and inside, the truth began its slow settling into every corner of the room. The garden was no longer in bloom. What roses remained had browned at the edges, their petals crisping like old paper. The grass, once thick and sun-warmed, had grown thin and damp underfoot. And yet Miss Marple had chosen this setting, a quiet afternoon tea in the autumn garden, beneath a soft grey sky, with the smallest of gatherings. Lydia Marsh sat with her gloved hands folded around a cup too hot to drink. Julian Hartley, stiff in his tweed, regarded the china as if it might accuse him. The vicar stood politely, always between the two, while Edward remained seated, shoulders drawn inward. Miss Marple poured second cups with gentle deliberation. The cake was untouched. There was warmth in the air, the warmth of manners, of ritual, but beneath it something brittle stirred, the kind of tension that comes not with quarrels, but with truths unspoken far too long. With a small, thoughtful motion, Miss Marple stirred her tea, her eyes fixed not on anyone in particular, but on the ripples in her cup. "It's a curious thing," she said softly, "how routines shape us more than memories ever do." Her guests glanced up, some puzzled, some wary. She did not wait for a response. Colonel Hartley had his habits, as men often do, the second chair in the arbor, the third biscuit, the spot near the lilac, things that seem small, but are remarkably consistent, so consistent in fact, that one could plan around them. She paused, lifting her spoon from the cup and resting it on the saucer. The silence grew closer. "I was thinking, only this morning, how a single place setting was arranged before the rest, as though someone already knew where the colonel would sit, even before he did." No one moved. The wind stirred the withering rose leaves beside them. "It wasn't the garden arbor that troubled me most," Miss Marple continued gently, "but rather the summer house, forgotten by most, but not untouched." Edward turned slightly, a flicker of surprise tightening his brow. Julian did not react. "I noticed the floorboards had been disturbed," she went on, "and the wicker chair there, old fraying at the base, yet recently adjusted. The cushion gave too much in the center. A needle concealed within a pressure device, precisely constructed and inserted." She folded her hands serenely. "It was placed not by chance but with care. The trap was not only in the chair, it was in the knowledge of which chair he would choose." A thin, sharp breath escaped Lydia. "It is quite something, I think," Miss Marple murmured, "to rely not on violence but on the weight of habit. One does not need to be present for such a crime. One only needs to know, and now they all knew she did. Julian Hartley set his cup down with exquisite precision. His expression remained impassive, almost studied, as though preparing for a photograph rather than a reckoning. "I'm afraid I have no idea what you're talking about," he said evenly. His tone was controlled, too controlled, not clipped with anger, nor softened with uncertainty, but shaped into a form of blank denial, the kind that left no edge for truth to catch on. "I didn't go near the summer house," he added, "and I certainly wouldn't know how to make contraptions." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, observing not his words but his fingers, which remained perfectly still upon his knee. No twitch, no tremor. A performance rehearsed, perhaps many times, behind closed doors. "Quite," she said softly. "How fortunate you are to be so certain. Not everyone can be." And her eyes moved slowly to Lydia. Lydia's cup trembled against its saucer. She had been silent for so long, the kind of silence that becomes armor, mistaken for poise. But now her throat tightened, and a colorless flush crept up her neck. All turned. "It was 3 days before," she said, her voice barely above the rustling leaves. "I'd come by early to leave a letter, and I saw Julian near the summer house. He didn't see me. He had something wrapped in cloth, and he looked around before going in." Julian turned to her slowly, but did not speak. "I didn't say anything," she went on, eyes wide, frightened not of violence, but of implication. I thought perhaps it was none of my business." She paused. "But I remember how he looked, not guilty. Just very, very sure of himself." The garden was suddenly too quiet. "I didn't tell anyone," Lydia said, her voice steadier now, but tinged with regret, "because I didn't want the name, his name, tied to scandal." She looked down at her gloves. "You see, I have no name of my own, only his. Illegitimate is the word they use." Even now, Miss Marple listened with the grave attentiveness of someone who had seen how society polishes cruelty into etiquette. "I didn't want to ruin what little place I had. If the truth came out, that I was his daughter, and something like this followed." She stopped, unable to finish the thought. "It wasn't just shame," she said quietly. "It was fear. Fear that if I said what I saw, it would turn the last thing I had, a connection however distant, into something poisonous." She looked up, not at Julian, but at Miss Marple. "But I see now, silence didn't protect me at all." Miss Marple placed her hands in her lap, the movement as deliberate as a benediction. "Hatred," she said softly, "has many disguises. It may wear a smile, or a collar and tie. It may attend church, or fund village fetes, but it does not remain hidden. It waits, and then it acts." She turned to Julian. "I believe you hated the Colonel not because he was cruel to you, though he may well have been, but because in your mind you had earned something owed to you by birth, by proximity, by all the quiet expectations people in houses like this begin to wear like skin." Julian opened his mouth, then closed it again. "You believed the girl didn't belong," Miss Marple said gently. "But you see, she did, and you could not abide it. The roses trembled in the wind, and so you prepared," she finished. Not with rage, but with the coldness of someone who has felt denied, and mistaken that denial for injustice. No one spoke. Even the wind had grown still. It was Constable Brent, red-cheeked and meticulous, who came upon the shed by chance, or so he believed. The structure had long been forgotten beneath the drooping boughs of the cypress, its door warped by damp seasons, its hinges grumbling in protest. Inside, Dust lay thick as flour, undisturbed save for a single patch of drag marks on the floor. Brent followed them with the dutiful instinct of a man who trusts his boots more than his brain. The toolbox was tucked behind stacked kindling, a battered iron thing with a clasp that opened too easily. Within fine blades, narrow as embroidery tools, curled lengths of trimmed wicker, each wound at the end as if tested for pliability, and most chilling of all, a flask with a faded poison marking, the crude outline of a skull, half rubbed away by time or use. Brent closed the lid with care and sent for Inspector Graves, and somewhere across the village, Miss Marple placed her sewing down without quite knowing why. When Inspector Graves arrived at Julian Hartley's modest lodgings, he did not knock first, a quiet man's privilege when guilt already stirs beneath the wallpaper. In the kitchen window, where the light was weak and the sill cracked with age, a drying rack leaned precariously on 2 bricks. From it hung a fan of pale, papery leaves, their stems too deliberate to be culinary, their shape unmistakable to any country gardener. Foxglove, not a vase's worth nor a physician's dose. No ribbon, no card, simply clipped, flattened, drying, too much for medicine, too little for beauty. Graves said nothing aloud, but his eyes moved slowly from plant to kettle, from kettle to gloves folded neatly by the sink. A house too quiet, a preparation too precise. Outside, the wind shook the cypress again. It was not the existence of the tools that startled Graves, it was their language. The notches in the blades, the fine gouges, the tiny burnished grooves from wax polish long settled. They spoke not of accident, but of habit. Wicker, he murmured, does not split this way on its own. He had spent years watching how men lied with their mouths while their hands told quieter stories. The same markings found in the base of the summer-house chair, untrained but careful, not a craftsman, no, but a hand determined to imitate the work of one. The cuts were shallow at first, experimental, then decisive. The killer had not learned in a night. He had prepared with time and with the arrogance of someone who believed his cleverness would outrun suspicion. And still, the cut reed told all. Julian Hartley was trimming back the ivy when they came for him, a quiet, almost ceremonial moment, his shears moving with the steady rhythm of someone clearing away guilt leaf by leaf. He did not resist, nor did he speak. It was only when he passed Lydia in the drive, she who stood motionless in a blue-grey coat too large for her frame, that his composure faltered. A glance, that was all, but it held no pleading, no apology. It was older than fear, older than hatred. It was the look of a boy who had once peered through a study door and found the man behind it already gone, replaced by shadows and secrets and favors denied. She did not return the glance, and the gate clicked shut behind him. Later that evening, as lamplight warmed the parlor and the kettle began its gentle murmur, Miss Marple sipped her tea with Mrs. Calthorpe, whose hands for once did not fidget with her apron ties. "It's a strange thing," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "how people are not often ruined by cruelty, but by the fear of what others might think." Mrs. Calthorpe nodded once, an instinctive weary agreement. "Julian was not unloved," Miss Marple continued, "but he was never affirmed. He was raised to maintain appearances, to hold his tongue, to polish his boots, and never ask why some letters were locked away and others read aloud. A pause. Men like the Colonel mistake silence for strength, and boys like Julian mistake silence for favor, until someone else appears with blood more rightful, if less respectable." Mrs. Calthorpe said nothing, but in her eyes something shifted. A long-forgotten memory stirred and settled again. "People do not kill," Miss Marple said softly, "because they are denied inheritance. They kill when they believe their place in the world has been erased. The fire crackled quietly between them. Julian might have accepted being passed over for money, perhaps even the house. But to learn that his uncle, the man he'd mirrored, obeyed, tolerated, had chosen privately to leave his name to a child born of no marriage, no blessing, no announcement. She let the sentence trail like smoke to a girl hidden in service, spoken of as a pity rather than a right. Mrs. Calthorpe drew in a breath. But he didn't know Lydia was the Colonel's until Miss Marple nodded gently, until Edward made the mistake of telling him, thinking, poor man, that truth might soften resentment. She set her cup down. But resentment is not soothed by honesty. It is only silenced when one feels superior again, and Julian had needed to feel superior, no matter what it cost. The sun had long since set, though its memory still brushed the rooftops in pale silver. Miss Marple, wrapped in a shawl the color of faded plum, walked alone past the shed beneath the cypress. The door, now padlocked, bore no sign of what had been there, save for the scent of dried wood and a faint trace of oil. She paused by the wicker chair, untouched since its removal. It sat crooked on the packed earth, one leg slightly shorter than the others, its pattern weaving shadows on the wall behind it. There was no movement, no threat, and yet it breathed of something that had not quite left. Pride, she thought, has many disguises, but none more dangerous than righteousness. She turned away, leaving behind the chair, the tools, the thorn, and the silence. Only the wind remained, whispering truths no longer needed. The morning had arrived with that peculiar stillness only December knows, the hush of a world suspended, as though the frost itself were holding its breath. Lydia Marsh stepped through the vicarage gate, and onto the old stone path, the crunch beneath her boots softened by a thin glaze of silver. Her breath lingered in the air, brief clouds that dissolved faster than memory. She did not shiver, though the cold reached the bone. The garden was stripped of color now, its once fragrant borders bare, the rose bushes shorn down to thorns and silence, yet something in her step suggested she knew where to go, past the holly, past the broken sundial, past the place where her father had once stood like a monument that refused to crumble. She paused, hand on the edge of a frost-laced branch. Her eyes searched, not for someone, but for something that had been removed. She stood still, and then she saw it. There was nothing remarkable about the spot, no stone marker, no trace of ceremony, just a patch of earth, slightly flattened, as though something heavy had stood there too long, now covered by brittle leaves that had neither the grace to flutter, nor the dignity to remain. Lydia knelt slowly, her gloved fingers brushing away a crust of frost to reveal the imprint of chair legs. 4 small depressions in the soil, unevenly spaced. The chair was gone. Of course it was, and yet she could feel it, the weight of presence lingering in absence. The way an echo lingers after a word never spoken. She lowered her eyes to the pattern the wicker had once pressed into the ground. A crosshatch of silence. Then she stood, exhaling once, not with sorrow, but something closer to preparation. She withdrew the letter from her coat pocket with a kind of ceremony that had been rehearsed too long. The paper had yellowed at the folds, soft as fabric, creased from years of being moved but never read. Around it, a square of old linen, hand-stitched, smelling faintly of lavender and thyme. Her name was written on the envelope in her own handwriting. Inside, unsent, lay the words she had once penned to a man who would never read them. She had written it before he died, in a moment of desperate courage, but something in her, perhaps pride, perhaps shame, had stayed her hand. She had sealed it, wrapped it, carried it through years of silence. Now she turned it in her fingers, as if unsure whether it belonged to the earth or the fire. Behind her, the gate gave a small click, and she did not need to turn to know who had arrived. No words passed between them at first. Miss Marple stood beside Lydia, with the calm presence of someone who had seen many things, and knew that endings, like beginnings, often required less talking and more listening. The older woman looked not at Lydia nor at the letter, but at the garden. "I always thought winter rather kind," she said gently, "not as a beginning, but as an observation. It covers what needs covering, and doesn't ask if it should." Lydia nodded once, still watching the ground. The moment did not feel dramatic, it felt accurate. As if life, in its most painful disclosures, arrived not with thunderclaps, but with the murmur of frost settling on hedgerows. They stood like that for some time, one holding a letter, the other holding space, and then at last the chair was spoken of. "It was never truly empty, you know," Miss Marple murmured, her voice as soft as the wind that curled beneath their coats. "Even when no one sat in it." Lydia turned to her. "It was just a chair." "Ah," said Miss Marple, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly, "but some chairs carry more than the weight of a man." She nodded toward the flattened earth. That one held pride, regret, silence, expectations so tightly wound that they snapped in the end. Lydia looked down at the letter in her hand. "But never love." "No," Miss Marple said quietly. "No, not love. And perhaps that is what wounded not what was done, but what was withheld." A gust of wind stirred the branches above. "Sometimes," Miss Marple added, "a heart that cannot speak of love tries to speak through control. It never succeeds. But it does leave bruises that take years to bloom." Lydia said nothing, but she understood. "I don't even know what I feel," Lydia said suddenly, the words tumbling out like snow shaken from a branch. "I thought I hated him, then I felt nothing, then I imagined explanations." She opened the linen wrap, exposed the letter's crease. "I think what I can't forgive," she said softly, "is not that he turned me away, but that he never tried to explain why." Miss Marple listened, her hands folded in front of her, like a hymn unsung. "He chose silence," Lydia said, her voice tightening, "when he could have chosen truth, or kindness, or even shame." A long pause. It was a wound stitched shut without cleaning. Miss Marple looked at her gently. "Sometimes, my dear, people are not silent because they do not care. They are silent because they are too broken to risk what speaking might shatter." Lydia's eyes shimmered, but she did not cry. Snow had begun to fall, quietly, without insistence. It did not swirl or bluster, it simply descended, flake by flake, as though the sky had decided to forgive the earth one petal at a time. The garden received it willingly. The brittle leaves surrendered, the flattened patch of earth grew pale. "It's strange," Lydia said at last. "It looks peaceful now." "It is," Miss Marple replied, "because snow is not for the dead. It is for the living, for those who must carry on with quieter hearts." They watched the bench gather frost. The spot where the chair had been now looked no different from the rest of the lawn. The past, it seemed, could be buried, not erased, but quieted, and Lydia, holding the unopened letter, let her fingers go slack. The wind took nothing from her, but the snow gave everything back. Miss Marple remained after Lydia stepped away, her gaze softening as the footprints grew more distant. "It isn't grief," she said aloud, though no one was there to hear her. "Not really, that passes." She looked toward the place where the chair had once stood, not for answers, but for what remained when all the noise was done. "It's the bitterness that follows," she continued. "The kind that lingers after the tears dry, when no one is left to blame, and yet something still aches." She thought of all the sons and daughters who had asked for nothing more than a name spoken kindly, and of those who could never speak it, of pride mistaken for principle, of silence chosen over redemption. The wind grew colder, but her shawl held. Bitterness, she said softly, has no shelter when the storm is gone. And still, the snow fell. Lydia's steps were crisp in the fresh layer of snow, clean, deliberate, unhurried. She did not look back. In her absence, the garden regained its hush. The letter, still sealed, still folded in its linen, lay beneath the bench, not discarded, not buried, simply placed, as if offered back to the earth from which its pain had once grown. Miss Marple glanced down at it, but did not move to retrieve it. Some things, she knew, were never meant to be read, only released. Behind her, the sky was brightening, the snow still falling, but thinner now, more delicate. The garden shimmered, not with grief, but with finality. And when she too turned to leave, her steps did not cross Lydia's. They made a second path, parallel but unjoined. Two lives, she thought, no longer needing to intersect to be understood, and neither would return to that chair again. And so the wicker chair stands empty now, not only of a man's weight, but of the quiet cruelties that lingered unspoken for far too long. In the end, it wasn't the poison that struck first, but the slow corrosive ache of resentment, wrapped in family names, sealed in silence, and passed on like heirlooms best left untouched. Miss Marple, with her soft voice and sharper insight, reminds us that the most dangerous motives often wear the gentlest disguises, and that sometimes the deadliest things in a garden are not the thorns, but the feelings we pretend not to feel. What do you think? If you were Lydia, would you have forgiven the Colonel, or confronted him sooner? And if you were in Miss Marple's place, what detail would have caught your eye first, the empty saucer, the loosened reed, or the silence that came too easily? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing your thoughts, your theories, and what this story stirred in you. It also helps more cozy mystery lovers find our stories. And if this tale of secret suspicion and quiet justice kept you company today, we'd be ever so grateful if you'd like, share and subscribe. Send this to a friend who enjoys a fireside puzzle, or to someone who always suspects the teacup. Until next time, keep your eyes open, your tea warm, and your heart just curious enough. Another mystery will be waiting.